Hello, I'm back yet again with more of this. Apparently this is all I do now on this channel. It won't last forever though. I hope.
Final judgment answers the problem of evil, but second, it helps explain our longing for justice. You see, many people have no problem with a loving God who forgives. What they have a problem with is a loving God who punishes.
Man, I sure wish I wasn't in the opening 30 seconds of the video here. I want to say this much more harshly, but I don't think I should yet. So, yeah, people have a problem with a loving God who punishes, just like when some parent does some horrible thing, which I'll leave up to your imagination, to their kid, just for talking back to them. What people have a problem with is the fact that the kid got punished at all. Not the fact that it was a completely unwarranted, vicious attack on a helpless individual. Nope, the entirety of the objection is just punishment bad. You know, someone in the comments on one of the previous videos where you were talking about whack-a-mole described what you're doing to make the game easier as switching the game to whack-a-straw-mole instead. I like it.
That's the problem.
No, it isn't, and you know it isn't. The sad thing is your audience might actually believe you here.
Now, I think this might be a secular Western phenomenon. Most of us in the Western world, we live protected lives. We have our rights. And when those rights get violated, we look to the government for justice.
Oh boy, I'm starting to get excited for this argument. What's it gonna be? You don't deserve rights? If people violently mistreat you or other people, you should just suck it up and stop whining? Or to hell with proportionality, justice is just kind of irrelevant in Christianity? I don't know, I really don't know where this is going. Probably not there, if I'm being realistic. But even so, it's looking good.
When injustice takes place, what do? We go to the police. We call our lawyers. We go to our government officials. Why? To make things right.
And things being right is a lie from Satan. God don't put up with none of that. I mean it, I really don't know what comes next. I don't think I've ever listened past this point, or even to this point. But it kind of sounds like it's heading in that direction, doesn't it? To be clear, I don't think that's what he's actually going to say.
That's what we do. It's easy for us to scoff at divine justice when we are so used to counting on human justice.
What? Okay. If you're scoffing at divine justice because you don't believe God exists, that's because you don't believe it's real. People are insisting it's going to happen, and you're like, evidence at all? Anything? Convince me somehow, or I'm just going to laugh at you. It's not because we're used to relying on human justice. That's got nothing whatsoever to do with it. It's about whether your claims appear factually based or not. If I thought there was a God, and I thought there was this divine justice, I would not be scoffing at it. I would be, if it's anything like you describe, absolutely terrified by it. I mean, it sounds unbelievably arbitrary and cruel. Of course, then you'd probably still say I'm scoffing at divine justice by describing it in those terms, if I dared to do so, anyway. But again, that would have absolutely nothing to do with whether or not I relied on human justice. It would have everything to do with the nature of the divine justice, and my views on that. This is already absolute nonsense. What the hell are you talking about?
But in places where there is no human justice, they don't scoff at divine justice, they cry out for it.
Do they? Really? Okay, so someone's living under an extremely oppressive regime, some place where you can't speak your mind at all for fear of being, I don't know, gulagged. If anyone, even your own kids, ever finds out that you've had a single thought that contradicted the party line, your life is over. And so you turn to the heavens and you cry out, God, I don't believe you exist. Please, for that terrible crime that's caused such infinite harm, burn me alive in hell for eternity. At least then I'll have experienced some version of justice. Oh, and while you're at it, my parents and my kids also don't believe in you, so burn them too. That'd be much appreciated. Thanks, buddy. Yeah, I'm sure that happens a lot. Now, of course, I know what you're actually trying to say. You're talking about people in desperate situations, dealing with people who are treating them terribly, hope for God to take vengeance on the bad people in the afterlife, and meanwhile, give them some relief in the afterlife. It's relatively common, obviously, for religiosity to increase in worse situations, just like every other kind of wishful thinking. And that's whatever. I won't begrudge someone in a really, really awful situation for holding on to something like that, even if it's not completely rational. You know, if it gets them through the day, fine, totally fine. Of course, there's still an issue with wanting your enemies to experience infinite torture. But they're human, they're not perfect, the situation's really bad. I choose to forgive those kind of lapses. Hell, if you really sat them down and asked them, do you really want this person to be punished infinitely for what they've done? Maybe you could even get a lot of them to agree, okay, it probably should end sometime. But anyway, just because desperate people in really terrible situations have emotional, irrational responses, does not mean that the problems that become clear when you sit down and think about the issue aren't problems anymore. Like, you can call me spoiled all day. You can say, you just got it good and you're not being regularly psychologically tortured by your government. And that's the only reason that you're pointing out the inconsistencies in my belief system. If your life was totally fucked and you didn't even have the luxury of taking the time to consider this stuff, you'd probably agree with me. Okay, and? Can we get back to the point now? Those moles are still popping up. Just because you tell the guy running the joint, hey, if you were way more poor and your life was totally different, you might not even be running a whack-a-mole game. You might be running one of those little weird rubber ducky games over there. That doesn't mean he's going to stop and go, oh my goodness, you're right. Here's the biggest prize in the booth.
Yale theologian Miroslav Volf. He saw thousands killed and millions displaced in his homeland of Yugoslavia. He has us imagine trying to give a lecture in a war zone on how God's retribution is incompatible with his love.
Is your argument seriously going to be the people wouldn't like to hear it at that moment in that place, and therefore it's not actually a problem? They don't like it, therefore it's false, is what you're going to tell me. Please, prove me wrong.
How his wrath is incompatible with his love. How his judgment and justice is incompatible with his love. And he says this, among your listeners, you're giving this lecture, among your listeners are people whose cities and villages have been first plundered.
Yeah, we don't need to hear this read slowly in the voice you'd use to read a children's book. Pause the video and read it if you want to.
If God were not angry at injustice and deception and did not make the final end to violence, God would not be worthy of our worship.
All right, so the argument is bad things happen to people, and if God didn't make that end at some point, he wouldn't be worth worshiping. Of course, the first thing to wonder is why he made it possible for such things to happen in the first place. I mean, he could just as easily have made it so that if you try to set someone's house on fire, nothing happens, or like you get set on fire, or if you try to slit someone's throat, your knife turns into jello. You know, not a God who allows violence for thousands and millions of years, but a God who never allows it in the first place. And of course, you know, free will, all that, sure, he'll allow you to try, it just won't be physically possible. Kind of like how he'll allow you to try to flap your arms and fly, but it's not physically possible, right? Do you think these people with all these problems, with the raping and the pillaging and all that, do you think maybe they would appreciate a scenario like that, where none of it ever happened because the people who tried to do it were just physically incapable of doing it? Every time some guy tries to commit a rape, his dick falls off? Does that not sound better than forcing people to live through it all and then tossing half of them into hell because they didn't believe the right way anyway? And as for anger, yeah, sure, God can be angry when people try to hurt each other. You know, even if they're physically not capable of doing it, the fact that they want to do it at all, yeah, he could get mad about that. I don't know if they would even have the concept of hurting people if it was physically impossible, but maybe. You know, people have the concept of doing magic, and that's physically impossible. And apparently God really doesn't like people trying to do magic either. So if somebody thought, you know what, I'm really mad at that guy, I'm going to try to hurt him. Maybe it'll work this time. And he goes and he takes his little tinderbox and he tries to set fire to the guy's house completely ineffectively while he and his family are asleep. And it doesn't work, and he goes, aw. And he gets up and turns around to leave, and God's standing there, and he's like, hey, what the hell was that, man? You are acting like a little shit today. What's going on with you? Don't you pull that shit again, or you're not going to heaven. You're just going to cease to exist. I get angry at injustice and deception, kiddo. I will make a final end to violence. Don't test me. And seriously, you don't want to miss this party. I got cakes, all kinds of cakes. I got cheesecakes. I got chocolate cakes. I got fruit cakes. I got a lot of fruit cakes left. And I got videotapes. I got lots of videotapes. I've got the entire Harrison Ford collection. Actually, no, I don't have Star Wars or Indiana Jones, but I have the rest. So, you get yourself straightened up there, bucko. Jokes aside, is this not a God that's more worthy of worship than the one you present? The one that allowed all this atrocity, that created the universe knowing every moment of suffering these people would go through and did nothing to stop it, who won't even necessarily punish the people who did it. If they're devout Christians already, or if they convert and live an upstanding life after this point, they're going to heaven, right alongside these people. The ones who believed properly anyway, not the ones who will wind up in hell after all this suffering, which sounds very just, by the way. This might honestly be the worst counter-argument in favor of hell I've ever heard.
In his book, Free of Charge, Volf says this, Though I used to complain about the indecency of an idea of God's wrath, I came to think that I would have to rebel against a God who wasn't wrathful at the sight of the world's evil. God isn't wrathful in spite of being love. God is wrathful because God is love.
I still don't understand why a god like yours would create a universe that he ends up being wrathful about. I mean, he knew he was going to be annoyed about it. Why didn't he just make a different one? You know that YouTube channel? It's this kid called, I think it's Michael Reeves? He makes intentionally annoying robots and other similar devices. Like, what's an example? I'm just going to go look it up. Yeah, here we go. The Roomba that screams when it bumps into stuff. If you can't find Waldo, you get tased. If you can't drink fast enough, this cup tases you. So what God's doing in your religion is like building that cup, knowing full well what it's going to do, and then sitting down to have a nice, relaxing morning coffee out of your cup and going, what the fuck? This cup keeps tasing me. What the hell? Why is this happening? I'm so wrathful about this. Does nothing about this strike you as a little bit stupid? Nothing at all? And of course, then there's the other point that, okay, yeah, be wrathful. Why does that mean you have to infinitely torture people? Setting aside the fact that you're not torturing people for their crimes, you're torturing people for their non-belief, but why infinite torture? Why is that the only option in this guy's head? Why does he think that's the only solution God has? God has no other option. He's forced to torture people infinitely. Like, I'm sorry, but just because you personally feel wrathful at the problems in the world, just because you want there to be some kind of final solution, that doesn't address any of the serious flaws in this belief system. Your feelings are not a fucking argument. If I was confronted with a million great arguments that hell exists and I had no counter-arguments, the fact that I didn't like the idea would not invalidate the arguments. It wouldn't suddenly mean there doesn't need to be an answer. And vice versa for you.
You see, there's no incompatibility between love and final justice.
Final justice being your cowardly code word for hell. Interestingly, the guy never actually says hell. He says wrath. And you know, I could totally buy an argument that, like, if God happened across a universe that he didn't create exactly the way he wanted it, he just stubbed his toe and looked down and was like, oh, there's a little universe down here. Let me check it out. And he picks it up and looks at it and goes, what the hell? There's all these people getting hurting each other, there's natural disasters, things are going crazy on this one little planet in here, but you know, these people, I feel such an emotion towards them, I feel such love towards them, and so I feel so angry that all of this bad stuff is happening to them. Oh, it's terrible. Yeah, I can buy that. Sure. Wrath is not really the problem here. Even if he then decided to inflict some degree of punishment on the people who had been doing this to other people, that also wouldn't really be a problem. The problem would be if he then decided to, well, you know what? I don't even have to say it. You know what the problem is. I've said it a million times. Why am I repeating myself? Well, because you're repeating yourself. You're just repeating these feeble, garbage arguments, avoiding the point, addressing completely different points. Wrath and hell are not the same thing. An argument addressing wrath, anger, just in a general sense, is a completely different argument about a completely different topic than any argument about hell. And yet you conflate them because in your head they're the same thing. But they're not. If you get wrathful at your child for doing something terrible to someone else, you don't have only two options, which are do nothing or behead them. Justifying the fact that you're angry does not justify that action. Do you understand? Is this really that complicated?
As Wolf points out, a God who is indifferent towards injustice would not be a good God.
Well, as I said before, I think hell is definitionally unjust, just purely based on what the word means. And yet he's not indifferent towards it. In fact, he's the one who made it work that way. He 100% endorses it. I mean, he's the guy doing it right now. He could put a stop to it anytime he wants. But setting that aside and addressing just what you've said here, I could certainly buy that a God that's indifferent towards injustice would not be a good God. In fact, that's a key component of the problem of evil, so the fact that you're saying that really doesn't do you any favors. But again, of course, the options are not just indifference or infinite torture for disbelief. We're talking about an all-powerful God. Not only are there not just two options, there's basically infinite options. Any solution anyone can ever come up with, no matter how wild it may be, is 100% within the capacity of this God to do. So to pretend as if there's some sort of binary choice here, that God is so constrained that these are his only options, is tantamount to a denial that God is God. It's saying, no. God's not all-powerful. God doesn't have options. God can't make things the way he wants them to be. He can only do these two very specific things that I say he can do. Oh really? So what, are you God now? I see how it is. It's funny how God always seems to be constrained and defined by the minds of the believers. He's never an entity of his own. Very interesting.
You see, it is precisely because God is good that he must punish the guilty.
The narrow-mindedness it takes to accept these kind of arguments is just amazing at times. It's really, really hard to understand how people can be this blinkered.
The goodness of God requires hell. It requires final judgment. It's a manifestation of God's perfect justice.
I'm not sure how much violence in the world today comes directly from people believing in your religion. It's hard to say. It's probably not that much of it percentage-wise. But I do wonder how much violence in the world could be prevented if people were not brought up to believe that this is what justice looks like. Perfect justice. If people think this is what's good, if people think this is how to make the world right, if people think that when they get angry when someone else says, you know what, that thing you just said to me, I don't really believe you, can you provide some evidence, please? If people think a proportional response to getting angry over that is to inflict unlimited suffering, and that's what the most perfect divine justice possible looks like, do you think people thinking like that has ever caused a problem for anyone? Do you think the fact that you guys convince people to think that is just free of consequence? That nobody's bad actions have ever been driven by their brains being twisted by this kind of idea?
Now think about this. Think about this. Even in our current cultural moment, we long for justice. In our current cultural moment, think about what's going on. This is why people hold the signs that say, no justice, no peace. It's the mantra of many who are marching in the streets in response to what they see as injustice, right? Our hearts cry out for perfect justice.
Sure, I'm pretty much on board with you, and I explained why I think that is in previous videos. I think most people would say they're pro-justice. I don't think that's a controversial statement. Sometimes we disagree about the facts of a case or something, and so we disagree about what justice actually is in that scenario, but I think we all want to see it. Well, most of us. And of course, that's exactly why when you describe what you think perfect justice is, it makes me feel sick to my stomach.
But that's something that no earthly justice system will ever satisfy.
No, of course not, because people are not all-knowing, people are not all-powerful, and people are not all good. What are you gonna do, cry about it? We're doing the best we can here, man. If you see certain changes you think would make it work better, advocate for them, but beyond that, boo fucking who, it's not gonna be perfect, I'm sorry. Your life in general is not gonna be perfect, so it fits right in. But see, it works that way because humans are not gods. What's God's excuse?
Only God can provide that.
Only God can provide that. He won't. But he can. Oh good, that makes me feel so much better. Seriously, I've never understood it. How bad does your life have to be that this is the hope you cling to?
Only God can provide that. We cry, no justice, no peace. But if there's no God, then there's no final justice.
Oh no, and we'll have to deal with our problems like grown-ups and accept that not everything has a perfect solution. But that can't possibly be real, even though it reflects every aspect of our lives, because I don't like it.
No justice, no peace, rather no final judgment, no ultimate justice.
Okay, I can live with that. What's the problem? If I want there to be justice, I'll try to make it happen. I don't need someone else to help. Okay? If I don't manage in the end, well, I tried. Honestly, we're just running Westerners down saying, oh, you're just spoiled. You just go run into the government or the police when you want justice so that they can do the justice for you. How is that any different than what you're doing right now? Daddy government, daddy God. Everyone wants a babysitter. The only difference is the government and the police, when they get involved, at least there's some sort of effect in reality. Might not be the effect you want necessarily, but it's an effect.
What I'm appealing to here is what Francis Schaeffer called the mannishness of man.
It sucks. I hate it.
The mannishness of man. In the book Tactics, Greg Koukl, He says this, and he's going through the tactic called inside out. The best chapter, I think, in the whole book. And he says, because we all live in God's world and are all made in God's image, there are...
Okay, so it's just people like justice, people like morality, and that's from my God because I say so, right? Is that pretty much the argument? Broadly speaking, people have some things in common. Priorities, ideas about the way the world should work. It's got nothing to do with human experience. It was just put in their hearts by God, and because I say that, that means it's true, end of story. And presumably that's why the atheists have morality and aren't just eating babies, and yeah, we all know this one.
There is something within us that demand that those responsible for injustice stand before a judge and pay for their crimes.
Okay, let's run with that. So there's something inside of you that demands justice, whether it was put there by God or nature or culture or whatever else. Pick a card. You want to see justice happen. And therefore, like, okay, I want a thing, and that tells me what about reality? I'm on a desert island with one other dude, and he gets hungry and eats my foot while I'm asleep. And I wake up and I go, hey, where'd my foot go? Oh, I'm so mad. I sure wish this guy would stand before a judge and get a sentence and infinite torture. That part's really important for some reason. Well, good. Now that I know justice is gonna happen, I better go find that courthouse. I'd expect that from a guy who hadn't had a drink of water in 4 days, and somehow managed to lose a foot without even waking up. But I'm fairly sure that doesn't describe you, so you don't get a pass. Alright, I'm gonna call that the end of this video. I honestly don't even know if it's a good place to stop, but I'm stopping. Thanks a lot for watching. If you don't mind, before you go, please give the video a like and click subscribe. Huge thanks to all of my supporters. Early videos if you sign up to my email list at list.logicked.com, and see you next time.